Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today, we're going back to school. Well, high school, to be exact. We're going to crack open a textbook.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, Chapter 14 of your Class 12 physics textbook.
Yeah.
From India's NCERT. It's called Semiconductor Electronics, Materials, Devices, and Simple Circuits. And shout out to the NCERT for making all this knowledge free for everyone.
Absolutely.
So I know that physics can sometimes feel like just a dense jungle of equations.
Oh, yeah.
But this is the stuff that's really the secret sauce behind all the gadgets that we use every day.
That's right. All the cool tech that we rely on comes down to these fundamental principles.
So picture this. It's the early days of electronics.
Okay.
Way before smartphones and laptops were even a glimmer in somebody's eye.
Yeah.
Electronics relied on these bulky, power-hungry things called vacuum tubes.
Right, like those old school radios with the glowing tubes inside.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, those are the dinosaurs of electronics. Big, clunky, and not very efficient.
Really inefficient.
And they needed a whole vacuum inside to work, hence the name. And they were always burning out, just like a light bulb.
So what came next?
Then came the semiconductor revolution. These materials, like silicon and germanium, were smaller, they used way less power, and they lasted much longer.
It was a total game changer.
Totally. It's like comparing a horse-drawn carriage to a high-speed bullet train.
Nice.
Semiconductors were faster, more efficient, and they just opened up this whole new world of possibilities.
So what makes semiconductors so special? What's the secret behind their superpowers?
It all comes down to their unique ability to conduct electricity, but in a controlled way.
Okay.
So think of it like this. You have metals, which are like superhighways for electrons, letting electricity flow through them super easily.
Okay, so metals are great conductors. What about the opposite? The things that block electricity?
Those are insulators like rubber or glass. They're like roadblocks for electrons, preventing any current from flowing through.
So where do semiconductors fit into this picture?
They're the in-betweeners. So imagine a country road. Sometimes cars can pass through easily, and sometimes there are obstacles that slow them down. Semiconductors are like that. Their ability to conduct electricity depends on certain conditions, like temperature or the presence of impurities.
Ah, so that's why they're called semiconductors.
Exactly.
They're not full-on conductors,
Right.
but they're not insulators either.
Yeah.
They're somewhere in between.
That's a pretty clever name, actually.
It is, and it perfectly captures their unique behavior.
Yeah.
To really understand how this works, we need to zoom in and look at the atomic level, where electrons are zipping around on these energy highways called bands.
Energy bands? That sounds a bit trippy.
It's all about how electrons are arranged within a material.
Okay.
In metals, those energy highways are wide open. Electrons can flow freely with almost no resistance.
Okay.
In insulators, there are huge gaps between the bands, like massive roadblocks, making it nearly impossible for electrons to cross over.
And what about semiconductors? What do their energy bands look like? They have a small gap between their bands, like a toll booth on a highway. Sometimes electrons have enough energy to pay the toll and cross over, and sometimes they don't. And that's what gives semiconductors their unique, controllable conductivity.
So we can tweak the toll booth to control how easily electrons flow through the semiconductor.
Exactly.
That's pretty neat.
Now let's dive into two main types of semiconductors,
Okay.
intrinsic and extrinsic. We'll start with the pure and simple intrinsic semiconductor.
Sounds like we're about to get down to the nitty-gritty.
Think of pure silicon or germanium, the classic intrinsic semiconductors. In these materials, atoms are bound together by sharing electrons, forming what are called covalent bonds.
Okay.
Picture these bonds as electron pairs holding hands, keeping the atoms tightly connected.
So the electrons are all paired up, happily holding hands. But something tells me this peaceful picture is about to change.
You're right. Enter heat. When we apply heat to a semiconductor, it's like injecting energy into this cozy hand-holding scene. Some of those covalent bonds break, and electrons get excited, freeing themselves from their atomic partners.
So now we have these free electrons roaming around. What happens to the spots they left behind?
Those empty spots are called holes.
Okay.
And they're not just empty spaces. They act as positive charges, attracting other electrons. It's like a game of musical chairs. When an electron jumps into a hole, it leaves behind a new hole, creating this continuous movement of charge carriers.
So in an intrinsic semiconductor, both the free electrons and the holes are contributing to the flow of electricity.
Precisely. It's like having two types of vehicles on the highway.
Yeah.
Cars, electrons, and motorcycles, holes, both contributing to the traffic flow.
I like that analogy.
Now, this is where things get really interesting, extrinsic semiconductors.
Extrinsic semiconductors. I'm picturing some serious semiconductor sorcery about to happen.
You could say that extrinsic semiconductors are all about manipulating the properties of semiconductors by adding impurities,
Hmm.
a process called doping.
Doping, is that like giving semiconductors a performance boost?
Exactly. It's like adding secret ingredients to our semiconductor recipe to enhance its conductivity. There are two main types of doping,
Okay.
N-type and P-type.
Okay, let's break it down. What's the deal with N-type doping?
Imagine we take our pure silicon semiconductor and we add a pinch of an impurity like arsenic, which has 5 outer electrons.
Okay.
These extra electrons from the arsenic are like adding more cars to the highway, making it easier for current to flow.
So N-type doping boosts the number of negative charge carriers,
Uh-huh.
the electrons. What about P-type doping? Does it add positive charges?
In a way, yes. With P-type doping, we add impurities like boron, which only has 3 outer electrons. This creates more of those holes we talked about, the empty spots that act like positive charges.
So it's like opening up new lanes on the highway for those motorcycle-like holes to zip around more easily. Doping is pretty amazing. We can tweak the conductivity of a semiconductor just by adding a tiny amount of impurities. It's like semiconductor alchemy.
It really is remarkable. And with these doped semiconductors, N-type and P-type, we're now ready to create the building blocks of modern electronics, the PN junction.
This is where the real magic happens, right?
Absolutely. It's where we bring together a P-type semiconductor and an N-type semiconductor, and things get very, very interesting.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. What happens when these two semiconductor worlds collide? Right, so we've got our N-type semiconductor, which is like a highway packed with cars, electrons,
Right.
and our P-type semiconductor, which has all these extra lanes for motorcycles, holes to zoom around.
Yep.
What happens when we merge these two semiconductor superhighways together?
That's where the magic of the PN junction comes in.
Okay.
At the junction, those eager electrons from the N side see all those inviting empty spaces, the holes on the P side, and they
Yeah.
can't resist. They start diffusing across the junction, like drivers switching lanes to find a faster route.
So it's like a rush hour commute, with electrons and holes all trying to find their way to the other side.
Exactly. But as these charge carriers diffuse across the junction, they leave behind their immobile charged parent atoms. It's like leaving your car parked at the side of the road after you've switched lanes.
Okay, so we've got these charged atoms hanging out near the junction, and they're not too happy about the imbalance of charges. What happens next?
This region near the junction, where the immobile charged atoms are left behind, becomes depleted of free charge carriers. We call it the depletion region.
Okay.
It's like a no man's land between the two highways, where there are no cars or motorcycles allowed.
So this depletion region acts like a barrier,
Yeah.
making it harder for more charge carriers to cross over.
Precisely. And this barrier creates something called a barrier potential, a kind of voltage wall that prevents further diffusion of charge carriers. It's like a toll booth that suddenly pops up, stopping the flow of traffic.
So we've created this barrier, this voltage wall, by simply joining an N-type and a P-type semiconductor.
Yeah.
That's pretty amazing. But how do we actually use this PN junction to do something useful?
Well, this PN junction is the heart of a remarkable device called a diode,
Okay.
an electronic gate that allows current to flow in only one direction. It's like a one-way street for electrons.
A one-way street for electrons.
Yeah.
That sounds incredibly useful.
Sure.
How does it work?
Think back to our barrier potential, that voltage wall at the junction. If we apply a positive voltage to the P side of the diode, something we call forward bias, it's like lowering the toll booth and letting traffic flow through smoothly. Current can flow easily in this direction.
Okay, so forward bias opens up the gate. What happens if we apply a negative voltage to the P side?
That's called reverse bias, and it's like raising the toll booth even higher, creating a massive roadblock. Current can't flow in this direction.
So a diode is like a gatekeeper for electricity, allowing it to flow in one direction but blocking it in the other.
Yeah.
But where does this come in handy in the real world?
That's where the magic of rectification comes in. Remember how the electricity that comes from our wall outlets is alternating current, or AC, which constantly changes direction?
Right. It's like a highway where the traffic keeps switching directions every few seconds.
Exactly. But most electronic devices, like your phone or computer, need direct current, or DC, which flows in only one direction, a nice steady stream of electrons.
So how do we transform that chaotic AC power into the smooth, predictable DC power that our gadgets crave?
That's where diodes shine. They can be used to convert AC to DC, a process called rectification. It's like using those one-way gates to redirect the traffic, ensuring it all flows in the same direction.
So diodes are the heroes that make it possible for us to charge our phones and power our laptops from a wall outlet. I never realized they were so essential.
They are. There are two main types of rectification.
Okay.
Half wave and full wave.
Okay.
Half wave rectification uses a single diode to block the negative half of the AC cycle. It's like closing the highway in one direction, letting traffic flow only in the other.
Okay, so we're only using half of the available power. What about full wave rectification? Does it use the entire AC cycle?
You got it. Full wave rectification uses a clever arrangement of 4 diodes. It's like having a system of ramps and bridges that redirects traffic, ensuring a continuous flow in one direction, even when the AC current changes direction.
That's some seriously impressive traffic management. But even with this full wave rectification, isn't the resulting DC power still a bit bumpy since the AC current is constantly going up and down?
That's a great observation. And that's where filters come in. They're like noise-canceling systems for your DC power supply, smoothing out those bumps and providing a clean, stable flow of energy to your devices.
So filters are like those shock absorbers in a car, making the ride smoother.
Exactly. One common type of filter uses a capacitor, which is like a tiny energy reservoir that charges up during the peaks of the rectified output. Then when the voltage dips between those peaks, the capacitor releases its stored energy, filling in those gaps and creating a smoother DC output.
So it's like having a backup power supply that kicks in whenever there's a dip in the main power. That's pretty clever.
It is. And by carefully choosing the right capacitor, we can fine-tune how much smoothing we get, ensuring our devices get a nice steady flow of DC power.
Wow, thanks to diodes and filters. We've tamed the wild AC current from our wall outlets and transformed it into the well-behaved DC power that our electronics need. That's a pretty amazing feat. But I have a feeling we're just getting started with the wonders of semiconductors. What other marvels do these tiny components have in store for us? We've journeyed from those bulky vacuum tubes of the past to the sleek efficiency of semiconductors. We've unlocked the secrets of the PN junction, and we've seen how diodes can tame that wild alternating current, transforming it into that direct current that powers our digital lives. But I have a feeling there's even more to this semiconductor saga. What other wonders await us?
Get ready, because we're about to enter the realm of the transistor.
Okay, the transistor.
Arguably one of the most important inventions of the 20th century.
The transistor. That name rings a bell, but I can't quite place it. Refresh my memory. What makes the transistor so revolutionary?
Think of the transistor as a more sophisticated version of the diode.
Okay.
Remember how the diode acts like a one-way gate for electricity?
Right?
Well, the transistor takes that concept to a whole new level.
Intrigued. Tell me more. How does the transistor build on the idea of the diode?
Instead of just 2 semiconductor layers like the diode, the transistor has 3 layers,
Okay.
either an NPN or a PNP configuration. It's like a diode sandwich, with an extra layer in the middle.
A diode sandwich. I like where this is going. So what's the role of this extra layer?
That middle layer, called the base, is incredibly thin compared to the outer layers, the emitter and the collector. And here's where things get really interesting. By applying a small current to the base, we can control a much larger current flowing between the emitter and the collector.
Wait, so a tiny input current can control a much larger output current. That's like using a small lever to move a giant boulder.
Exactly. The transistor acts like a tiny valve, regulating a much larger flow of electricity. It's this ability to amplify signals that makes the transistor so incredibly powerful and versatile.
Amplification. Now that you mention it, I remember hearing that transistors are essential for audio equipment. Is that how they make our music louder?
You got it. Transistors are at the heart of amplifiers, which boost those tiny audio signals coming from your phone or music player, allowing them to drive speakers and create those powerful sound waves that we hear.
So when I crank up the volume on my stereo, it's thanks to those tiny transistors working their magic.
It is. And the beauty of transistors is that they amplify signals with high fidelity, meaning the amplified signal retains the characteristics of the original input signal, so your music sounds clear and crisp even at high volumes.
Wow, transistors are truly the unsung heroes of our audio experience. But I know they're used for so much more than just amplifying music. What other applications do they have?
Well, think about anything that requires generating repetitive electronic signals, like the clock signal that synchronizes everything in your computer, or the carrier wave that transmits radio signals.
Okay, those are pretty essential functions. But how do transistors create these rhythmic electrical pulses?
That's where oscillators come in. They're circuits that use transistors to create those rhythmic oscillations, those precisely timed electrical pulses that keep our digital world ticking.
So transistors can be amplifiers and oscillators. It's like they're the multi-talented musicians of the electronics world.
A perfect analogy. And all of this stems from that remarkable 3-layer structure. and the transistor's ability to control a large current with a small input signal.
Transistors are truly game changers. They've revolutionized the way we amplify and generate electronic signals. But I have a feeling the story doesn't end there.
You're absolutely right. The invention of the transistor paved the way for an even more mind-blowing development. The integrated circuit, or IC.
Integrated circuit, that sounds familiar. Does it have something to do with those tiny chips that are found in all our electronic devices?
You're on the right track. Instead of having individual transistors and other components wired together on a circuit board, integrated circuits pack an entire circuit with potentially billions of transistors onto a tiny chip of silicon.
Wait, so we're talking about shrinking down an entire electronic circuit onto a chip smaller than my fingernail. That's absolutely mind-boggling.
It is. And it's this miniaturization that has fueled the exponential growth of computing power and portability. It's why your smartphone, which fits in your pocket, can now outperform those room-sized computers from decades ago.
Wow, from bulky vacuum tubes to tiny integrated circuits packed with billions of transistors. It's been an incredible journey through the evolution of electronics. And to think, it all stems from the unique properties of those semiconductors.
It's a testament to human ingenuity and our ability to harness the power of nature at the atomic level to create world-changing technologies.
This deep dive has truly opened my eyes to the hidden world of semiconductors. Next time I use my phone or computer, I'll definitely be thinking about those tiny transistors and the amazing things they make possible. Thanks for being such a brilliant guide on this journey.
It's been my pleasure. And who knows what amazing new semiconductor-based technologies await us in the future. The possibilities are truly limitless.